Okay, welcome. Before I introduce this year's distinguished lecturers in art education, I'd like to briefly tell you a little about the special lecture series. When Dr. John Michael was a student at Penn State University, he was captivated by Dr. Victor Lowenfeld's telling of his personal history to young graduate students at the beginning of his class. Dr. Michael, God bless you, and his close friends in class, particularly Dr. Ellen Abel, talked about audio taping these. This is the days of audio tape, their personal account, his personal account of his life. And it was eventually done. We have those lectures here also. When Dr. Michael finally came to Miami University in 1961, he taught a history of art education class to graduate students. And after several years, thought it would be really inspiring for young art educators to invite outstanding people who had retired or were near retirement to come to Miami to tell their story of the life and recognition in the field. The first such lecture was held in 1972 by Dr. Edwin Ziegfeld. He was the first president of NAEA and also the first president of INSEA, the International Society Education Through Art. And he was chair of the Department of Art Education at Columbia University. Dr. Michael looked at these lectures, I think, in a very inspiring way as the Art Education Hall of Fame. In 2001, these edited lectures were published by NAEA. In 1995, Betty and John Michael endowed the series, with the first lecture being Dr. Elliot Eisner. The lectures are part of a larger collection of art education archival materials, which are currently housed at the Miami University Archives, as well as in the Arts and Architecture Library, which is now what's called the Victor Lowenfeld Memorial Collection of Art Education Books. Without the support of Dr. Robert Schmidt, who's not here, he is the university archivist, and his associates, the sources of these archival holdings are now online. What this really means is that anyone in the world is now able to see what is housed in the archives, and they then, considering visiting Miami University, look at these materials for research purposes. First, I would like to thank Betty Michael, right here, who is in the audience, as well as acknowledge John's sister, Evelyn Edwards, for all they've done to continue to support this lecture. Without Dr. Michael and Betty in particular, this lecture series would not be possible. Thank you so much, guys. You're really terrific. There's some other special guests in the audience. We have actually the 19th lecturer in this series, Dr. Laura Chapman here, who continues to distinguish herself through exemplary work in curriculum, advocacy, and criticism of current national agendas in art and education. And all I remember is when NAEA was thinking of what would be their next initiative, the entire executive committee came up here to talk with Laura and find out what her insight is. And so thank you for being here, Laura. Thank you. I'd also like to thank Cynthia Collins, who has been a great supporter of this lecture series. She is the Curator of Education at the Miami Museum, Art Museum. Thank you also for being here. Also in our audience is Professor Tom Effler, Chair of the Art Department, who has always graciously supported this series, and this year in particular has extended some additional funding from the Art Department in order to be able to bring in 2 lecturers for this year. Thank you, Tom, personally. Thank you. I'd also like to acknowledge my colleagues in art education. Without this whole experience would not be possible. First, Dr. Julia Lindsay, who has been very diligent in planning and orchestrating this year's lecture. And as well as Dr. Jean Langen, who, with her kind support and help, is always making these things possible also. She always goes the extra mile. Thank you both very much. There's also an important group, also, Mary Hessling, who has been teaching the Saturday art classes, a very strong advocate of our program. Thank you also, Mary, for doing such a good job at Saturday art, really, and all of the support you've given us. Thank you very much also. In our audience also are students in art education who are the hope of the future, all you guys out there. It will be through their expertise, research, and diligence and leadership, right, that will make the necessary difference in propelling the profession into the mid-century. We're not that far away. Thank you for making this commitment also, and for being here. Thank you very much. I would now like to introduce to you our guest lecturers. We are all in store for something very special. First, we have two exemplary lecturers. Each one has contributed to the profession of art education in extraordinary ways, put a phrase that I think Howard Gardner kind of exemplified in his books. In addition, they have also collaborated extensively in groundbreaking research. Yes, they are husband and wife, and a first in the series. So that's kind of very unique. Our 2010-2011 John and Betty Michael lecturers in art education are Dr. Brent G. Wilson and Dr. Marjorie Wilson. And they are here. Give them a little background. And this is really tough, because there's a lot of, Dr. Wilson, Brent Wilson here, has distinguished himself so well, and I looked at his 60-plus page resume without inflation, It was hard to summarize his accomplishments.
It wasn't even up to date.
I wasn't even up to date, so it's maybe 80 or 90. God bless him, it's just unbelievable. Dr. Wilson has an MFA in painting with minors in sculpture and ceramics from Cranbrook Academy of Fine Arts and a PhD in art education from Ohio State University. He has been a professor at several universities and the head of both the undergraduate and graduate program in art education at Penn State University. He has received every major award in art education from the National Art Education Association and is an elected distinguished fellow of this organization. He has written several important books such as The Quiet Revolution, Changing the Face of Art Education for the Getty Education Institute for the Arts, and with Dr. Marjorie Wilson, the multi-edition of Teaching Children to Draw, a guide for teachers and parents, and Teaching Drawing from Art. He alone has authored more than 25 major chapters and books and has delivered many research presentations and more than 100 keynote addresses at universities globally, not just in the U.S. 90 research articles of his own and joint research with Dr. Marjorie Wilson have been published in major journals in the U.S. and again globally. As an exhibiting artist, for those of you that are also thinking of staying with art while you're a teacher or an art educator, he has had 31-person exhibitions and has been a consultant in many important assessment and curriculum endeavors in the U.S. and abroad. It's 60 pages.
You're making me tired.
Couldn't quite distill that, Dr. Marjorie Wilson has distinguished herself in her own right through her research and teaching. She has earned 4 major degrees from prestigious institutions, such as the Pratt Institute in New York City, the Massachusetts College of Art, as well as a doctorate in art education from Penn State University. Dr. Wilson developed a strong understanding of art education through 10 years of teaching art at Tappan Zee High School in New York before eventually attaining several professorships in higher learning, including Penn State University, where she was a professor of art education for 18 years. Her professional activities are numerous, such as being the prime author of a series of guides for teachers, published and distributed with print reproductions of major works of paintings, to cultural, historical, philosophical, and critical aspects of those works. The successful series, Art Education, was published between 1987 and 1991. She was a researcher for the J. Paul Getty Trust and was asked also to be an art consultant for the National Assessment of Educational Progress. Dr. Wilson has received numerous distinguished achievement awards, such as the Manuel Barkin Award for Outstanding Contributions to the Professional Literature in the Field of Art Education. This is an NAEA award. Her research activity as an assessor in critical curriculum matters pertaining to DBAE, you all know the term, discipline-based art education, is a wonderful achievement in itself, since it very much helped propel education into what it is today. She has numerous papers published in conference proceedings, as well as in policy review publications. In addition, her futuristic insight into how the internet could be used in art education pedagogy was presented at several international conferences, which undoubtedly prepared the way for today's art teachers' use of technology and the internet. Professor Wilson has given many lectures, research presentations, keynote addresses, and her ideas continue to be on the cutting edge of the thoughtful uses of technology in the classroom. Okay, now a little quick aside here. I'm truly pleased to have them both here. When I was a graduate student in art education at Penn State University, I had the privilege of being Dr. Wilson's research assistant. In retrospect, I appreciate his patience with me in those formative years. You imagine how that was, right? Showing me the ins and outs of research. He was very kind and supportive of my enthusiasm and at times naive and untested understanding of art education and the diplomacy of every day. Marjorie was always enthusiastic about her research and always welcomed graduate students to her home. Thank you, Marjorie.
You had poisoned you?
Well, not at all, not at all. There's a story to that, yes. What I learned from both of them is to be a challenging, engaging, and fair teacher. Do one's research well, work hard, and make the strongest research case for new ideas. The Wilsons' ideas about the importance, and you guys know this, of culture and impact on children's art development, as well as the overall understanding of how visual culture can be used and contested in the everyday art classroom, I think is a very important contribution to art education. I sincerely welcome you both. It's just wonderful having you here, and I'm looking forward to an incredible presentation. From the airport here, you were giving me some highlights, and I'm anxious to see that. Thank you so much for being here.
That's a hard act to follow. I want to preface this whole thing by saying that little did I know when I married Brent Wilson that I had entered a lifelong competition that I could never hope to win, and tonight is no exception. I discovered very early in our relationship that in order to avoid disaster, we should not make presentations together, and we should never attempt to write together. I want to dedicate this to Rania and to all the kids and the teachers and the parents who encourage their kids to draw, and to Ami, who was the muse for the second edition of Teaching Children to Draw. Where's the sound?
It's okay.
Well, the sound is important because this is the video that I found on YouTube, and as Ami is drawing, her parents in the background are helping her to make this figure, which turns out to have 3 heads. And without the sound, it's... Imagine it. Just imagine it. It's okay. It's all right. This is, I said, when I first started to make this slide, I wrote the title on the top to be funny. It's like, imagination is funny. So, and then Brent added the life and hard times of M&B, and then later, or 157 years in 60 minutes. Except it was supposed to be 90 minutes, but whatever. And you're supposed to read this instead of my reading it. Michael Joyce, one of our greatest influences when we were dealing with hypertext, my students and I. And it certainly works here, because I'm not sure that everything isn't my story, or that whatever is my story is anything more than pieces of others' stories. Now first, there's the context. And this picture is a lie. It happens to be a pre-Photoshop pairing of a distinct impossibility. When I was 4 years old and drawing my tadpole people, Brent, as they used to say, was hardly a gleam in his father's eye. And when Brent was a Boy Scout in short pants, making his very first visit to New York, which he'll tell you about, I was married, living, and working in New York City. The particular story we're going to tell is really two separate stories, proceeding independently and unbeknown to one another for 40 years or more. Before the stories became one and ultimately two again. The stories began in two places, rural and urban, places that could hardly have been further apart geographically, conceptually, ideologically, artistically. And this is a picture that Brent took of me talking to the lion in Venice when he insisted that he take me to Europe before I fell apart. True story. I was born in Mattapan, Massachusetts, a suburb of Boston, just a short streetcar ride, a hop on the L, and in 30 minutes or so, the city where my father was a manager in an umbrella factory, where the shopping was, and the theater, and the swan boats. I include this image from around, come on, you're supposed to, you're supposed to work. It's not working. It was working. There it goes. I include this image, where am I? From around 1938, because Mr. Google found it for me, and it's exactly the way I remember it. The square and the streetcar and the wonderfully exotic Oriental theater. You can see the marquee with the gold Buddhas in their cubicles and the deep blue ceiling that went on forever with the clouds and the winking stars. I was one of those kids we write about and study. From the time I was 4, all I wanted to do was draw. And I remember my grandfather supplying me with reams of manila paper to draw on. I remember my first tadpole figure, and that's as close as I could get to, that's a coloring book image of a kid drawing from about that time, and that's me, and then I kind of womped up that little tadpole, because that's how I remember it. And I remember the picture I drew of my Didi doll, doing not what Didi dolls did, but more realistically, what kids did, what babies did, and then being really disgraced and made to fill in the whole back of the picture with that same yellow-brown color, and it's much more yellow-brown in the original slide. I remember the hot summer days when I was maybe 11 or 12, and the kids who lived near me, and they were all boys, of course, writing and drawing comic books. I wrote about those summers in Teaching Children to Draw, and in case you don't have a copy with you, I'll read that to you. When the streets became too hot for king or kickball or even hide-and-go-seek, we kids sought the relative coolness of the house and there spent the days orchestrating a production that we named Wham Comics. We jointly wrote the stories and the dialogue, delighted in seeing our creations come to life under the pencil of one or another of the members of the group. There, as we crowded around the glass-topped dining room table, the Red Ruby and Lightning and myriad lesser characters were born. Each of us took turns at drawing or writing, often both. Someone would be called home for lunch, and another artist would take over. Arthur, as I remember it, could draw men that looked particularly virile. Freddie's, not so much. But the hero of the stories was drawn by first one and then the other as the excitement of getting the hero out of some peril impelled us to complete the adventure. As the only girl in the group, I was assigned to draw all the heroines. It was even better than our Saturday afternoon forays to the mysterious Oriental Theater, where we sat on the edge of those itchy red plush seats, breathlessly waiting to see what would happen next to Dick Tracy or Tom Mix of the weekly serials. In our own serials, we could engineer what would happen and what would happen next, and it was ultimately more exciting and more stimulating and more satisfying than anything we could buy for a dime in the corner drugstore. Wham Comics was lovingly and carefully transported by me from place to place, from city to city, until years later, it somehow sadly disappeared. But the memory of Red Ruby, first Arthur's rendition and then Freddie's, fighting the forces of evil, vividly remains, along with the ice cream man's bell and the front porch swing and Frank Sinatra and the Red Sox of that long ago summer. When we ask children, what do you want to be when you grow up? How many of us really had any idea? Well, I'd say some of us. In his new memoir, Alan Arkin writes that from the time he was 4, all he ever wanted to do was act, and we know how that turned out. From the time I was 4, all I ever wanted to do was draw. And although there was a precedent for art, my aunt, who was an elementary school teacher, made lovely pastels of scenes in countries she visited on her summer vacations. And my father, it's not going to do it. Why are you not acting right? Good. Help! Wait, let me do this. See, I say,
how would you go back? Julie's a Mac person. She's
yeah, but so am I.
Okay.
So when I went forward, it disappeared.
Came back.
So I got that, but it's a blank slide.
Okay. Is it
It's
a blank
this
slide?
one.
It's not. It shouldn't be a blank slide.
Okay.
It should. It went all the way to the end.
Okay.
Sorry about that,
Okay,
folks.
let's see where we could pick it up.
I
That
can
is
do
the
it.
end?
I can do it.
They
Okay.
know what
If I can get this to.
Is it to go up?
2 fingers.
Yes,
Yeah, this
sure.
one,
No, it's not working. Let me do this.
There. There we go.
Okay.
I'll do it this way. See, I'm going to talk about how good I am at technology, and there you have it. It went to the end because it's being this is being, I should
Okay.
use my iPhone.
Okay.
It was the one before this. That's the right one. And, you know, we're not really getting the full slides. I don't.
That's okay.
It's okay. Sure, it's okay. So, back to where we were. My father, excuse me, copied pretty ladies from in colored pencil from the covers of the Ladies' Home Journal. And while he was doing his drawing, he was smoking. And on every package of his Tareyton cigarettes was a Henry card that I could copy. But nobody was an artist. In my early 1930s, artists came from some other exotic place, and their art was preciously guarded in museums. And this is the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, where my parents took me when I was 10. And I don't know why they took me. I assume it was a cultural thing, because I was interested in art. So what do you do if a kid's interested in art? You take them to the art museum. As opposed to the reason for my mother's taking me to see Charles Laughton in King Henry VIII when I was 4. And that was for dishes. Although I don't believe that the museum experience advanced or enhanced either my interest in museums or in art, that early exposure may have precipitated my interest in film, an element that has always found its way into my teaching. I've always thought that it must have been something important for them to have made the trip, which, because we had no automobile, involved several streetcar changes. I was later told that it was the first time that Van Gogh had been shown in Boston. And I don't remember really anything from when I was 10, except that I really was overwhelmed. I mean, I never saw art like this. And I don't know if this was the particular show, but there were 2 shows listed in 1939 at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, and I know I must have seen this painting because it was in those shows. Gee, I don't know what the next slide is, so I'm not going to push the button yet. Since becoming an artist was not even a thought, I aspired to be a teacher. Like my aunt, who often brought me to her 3rd grade classroom. I'm not sure when teacher became art teacher, but before entering junior high school, I marched up to the 6th grade principal's office and asked what courses I needed to take to apply to Mass Art. It was the Mass School of Art at that time, and it had originally been established as a state normal college. Alan Arkin and Brent Wilson, okay, that was all right, followed, it's very hard to read this, followed a pretty steady path to their goals. Mine sort of zigged and zagged. But then I was a woman in the 50s. I feel more like the song. This is the Mass Art, which has been torn down, much to my chagrin. But I feel, whoops, and I missed that slide. It's not there. darn, I'll have to sing the song myself. I was a pauper, a poet, a pirate, a pawn and a king. I've been up and down and over and out. Okay, that was what it was supposed to do, but it didn't. Hmm?
Better live.
Yeah? Okay. Cool. I did go to mass art. In fact, I went to classes in mass art on Saturday morning throughout my entire high school years. And I was taught by their faculty. At that time, they didn't have a special Saturday school faculty, but the faculty from the art school actually taught on Saturday mornings. So that when I applied in my senior year to go to school, I knew all the faculty, and so I had no trouble getting in spite of the fact that we probably had 3 high school graduates to 25 veterans. It was 1954. And that's a very important part of my life, and you'll see how it figures in later. But in my junior year, when I had to choose a major, I avoided art education like the plague. There was something about the tone. It was kind of self-important. It was like better than anybody kind of thing. I tried to avoid that in my own classes, and here I was supposed to have a picture of me lying on the floor with one shoe off in one of my classes, but I couldn't find the picture. Oh well. Where was I? So, instead, I zigged. I chose something else, another course. I chose design. I graduated with the first BFA as awarded, the first BFAs that were awarded at Mass Art. That was the first year that BFAs were awarded. Sorry about this. I got married, started a small silk screen operation, designing and producing placemats, got recognition in a long-defunct Living magazine and Akron Art Institute show promoting young designers in the 50s, with blurbs in the New York Times, in the New York Times Magazine, and my pieces were shown at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Boston and the Worcester Art Museum. I birthed 2 lovely children, and out of boredom, having long since given up the silkscreen business, there were fumes, and I got pregnant, and that wasn't a good thing. I zagged. I took a job as a substitute teacher in the tiny school system of Hull, Massachusetts. The newly appointed superintendent required only a college degree in order to substitute. But when at the end of the school year, the principal announced that he wanted to make me his top substitute, he said I needed a teaching degree, and I could get a quickie down the road at the State Teachers College. When I went to get my transcript, because Boston Teachers College was right down the street from Mass Art, the dean, with whom, coincidentally, I had graduated 14 years earlier, oh, how I had been wasting my life, convinced me to come back for 2 years to get my teaching degree. With my BS in education in hand, And this is me. And my hair was black at one time. It was. And those are my 1950s placemats. With my BS in art education in hand in the mid-60s, there were many options, and I had my choice of several teaching positions. I was ready to get away from the provincialism of Boston, and since I had lived and worked in New York in an earlier zig or zag or two, I chose to teach in a district close to New York City. At that time, although there was reciprocity with my Massachusetts degree, as I recall, I could only get permanent certification in 5 years with a master's degree. Someone must have suggested Pratt, I have no idea who, and I had my MS in art ed. I did. Come on. You're going to have fun with this. There it is. After 4 unmemorable summers of crossing the Brooklyn Bridge, my daughter, who was probably 12 at that time, held her breath every time I went to Pratt because she was sure I was going to drive off of the Brooklyn Bridge. Go figure. I was to return to Brooklyn some years later while doing research for the Getty, but that's another part of the story. After happily teaching at Tappan Zee High School for 7 years, being free with both my children in college and single, I decided to spend my sabbatical year pursuing a doctorate at Penn State. Isn't she cute? Stop. My experiences of teaching with teachers with superficial knowledge of art and artists spawned Jackson Pollock lessons of paint splattering on long rolls of brown wrapping paper, precipitated my commitment to finding and making meaning, and to teaching teachers. Brent Wilson was hired at the end of my sabbatical year. Sometime after his visit to the campus to interview, he had dinner with a group of us art ed grad students at the Chicago NAEA conference. I vividly recall his bemused reaction to my answer to his condescending question about what I intended to do when I got my doctorate. I mean, after all, I was over the hill. I was 45. He had gotten his doctorate when he was 32. During that same conversation, I told him about my research into the special atmosphere I had experienced at the Mass Art of the late 40s with a class composed primarily of returning veterans from World War II. I couldn't have known that this was very close to research he was doing at that time, but he promised to send me a paper he thought would be helpful. Have you ever told individuals that you'd met at a conference that you would send them a paper? But send the paper he did, and then they say, and as they say, the rest is history. That paper, Victor Turner's unpublished Liminality, Play, Flow, and Ritual, an essay on comparative symbology, and that's a mouthful, was not only to be the basis for my dissertation, but the key to understanding and strengthening my own teaching. When I returned to TZ, Brent spent a lot of time in my classroom, and as a not-so-silent observer, suggested that, because the subject was communicatas, the atmosphere of the mass art of the late 40s, he felt that this was the very atmosphere that I had created in my own classes, and that I use my classroom as subject of the study. This is bad. In this collaboration, as I see it, there are two distinct ways of seeing and responding to the worlds of art and research. Brent is first the artist and the researcher. These two things are foremost, and they then become the basis for his teaching. I am the teacher first, and the research has always been done primarily in the service of my teaching. So that while for Brent, Victor Turner precipitated more research, and does still, for me, his theories became an instinctive guide for my own understanding and practice of teaching. I have more to say before you get up. This is like a cliffhanger because we need to get to Brent's story and then our joint story before I return for Life After BW. So you need to remember where I left off. Now, if you click this so that you kind of touch, like you're right in that corner, you'll be fine.
Okay, we'll try it. But it's not, there it is. This is the Wilson Farm in Fairview, Idaho. Whoops, and already it's changed.
It is too hard.
Okay, that was actually 1964, and I had left. But that's a place that I spent a lot of my life in, and it couldn't be more different from Mattapan near Boston. And in 1998, I started drawing my life story. I'm in visual journal number 87 over on that table. I didn't start keeping journals until I was about in 1979. And in 1998, I started drawing my life story. This is the little, okay, that's the little house, two-room house that my father built in 1936. And it was at the base of a sand hill. And what I want to say here is that I was telling Ralph earlier that I'm convinced that my life, my interests, the patterns of my life, my character, what it was going to be, was all set by age 4. Because at age 4, I still remember being so delighted and intrigued by the Shoshone beaded gloves that my grandfather gave me. I remember especially running away from home. In the next slide you will see what punishment I got. But it was, well, I say running away or running to. But I have spent my life running away and running to other places, every place but the place that I am. But here it was, in one sense, seeking beauty, picking wildflowers, and they were so weedy that they wilted immediately. But I actually found an arrowhead on that sand hill. This is the canal that ran right by the house, and there I am imagining that I have drowned in it. This is my first artistic praise that I remember. My mother gave me a Sonia Henney coloring book, not comic book, and she praised me for how I did the pink costume and the white ruffles, and I knew I was really good. Now, here is my first artistic failure. It's upside down, but in Cache Valley, Idaho, it is sandy soil, the old lake bed for Lake Bonneville, which drained out to the northwest thousands of years ago. But the soil was sandy, and the early Mormon pioneers channeled Cub River so that it went into several canals and flowed throughout the valley. And as the Cub River flowed over the sandy soil and the quartzite pebbles were so absolutely beautiful that at age 4 I said, I have got to make that myself. So I gathered sand and pebbles and my mother's dishpan and poured the water in and made a mud pie. and this has been the story of my artistic life since then. But I still have memories of a coloring book that we had in third grade that gave instructions like color the parrot's feathers yellow and green. And I did, and it was yellow and green together were so vivid. So it's memories of this, that we have a kind of predisposition for certain kinds of experiences. And so there, when I ran away, my father because I ran away every day, and at age 4, obviously my parents were worried about me. My father literally chained me to the house. And, I have over-dramatized it, as I usually do, but that's the upper corner. But what I remember so vividly in my early aesthetic experiences are the Sunday funnies that came in the Deseret News with Mammy Yoakum and the Katzenjammer Kids. So here's that little house again, and the Katzenjammer Kids, and things like playing on a spring-tooth harrow and having getting my fingers squashed in it and so on. So my life story is full of these strange kinds of things. The tension between being tied down by a family and culture and at the same time having an open world that was delivered to our doorstep in the form of the Sunday funnies. And I begin to reflect back about the funnies and the varieties of artistic style. I mean, Little King, one of my favorites, with Art Deco, and the Katzenjammer Kids, which bordered on Expressionism. There was Henry, who was so simple and so easy to draw. And then I still remember now, at age 4 or 5, being put off by the kind of messy clutter of Out Our Way. And the realism and women's cleavage in Al Capp's Little Abner. I mean, here I was. The closest art museum was probably 800 miles away in San Francisco, and yet the world was coming to me. And Red Ryder taught me how to draw horses. So, school art, it was this is actually Fairview Grade School. It was 4 rooms. You started 1st and 2nd grade in that corner, 3rd and 4th grade there. You moved over to 5th and 6th grade, 7th and 8th grade. And it squashed you, sort of. But my 3rd grade teacher, who was my next favorite teacher, Miss Tanner, had very red hair, and one time she let us, there wasn't an art program, but she had an art education class, and so she let us, I think this was more social studies, but she let us dig clay out of the ground and build an Indian pueblo, and I still remember that vividly as one of the best times in all of elementary school. And as we were building this thing, I was wondering, what is it like to live in a pueblo? Later, in my life, I actually gathered Pueblo and Zuni and Navajo children's story drawings, and some of the Pueblo teachers took me into their homes in the Pueblo. And so, if you draw it, it will come true at some point in time. Now, the other story I remember about this, because these are little bits and pieces. Sometime I was telling Ralph that being invited to do this, I started going back. I only got to 8th grade in this particular journal, but I'm thinking, I'm going to go back and actually write all of the stories, because you see that little hot pad holder up there, whatever it is. This was the Christmas gift that we made for our parents by twisting crepe paper, the strands of crepe paper, and then gluing with that awful school paste. And I remember that Ruth Rollins did an orange circle and then put red in the middle. And Miss Tanner looked at it and said, dramatically tearing the red out, "Red and orange never go together." And I didn't dare put red and orange together for years, and yet I got to do it here. And but you see the kind of influence that our teachers have on us. Now, I became an art teacher in 4th grade. Well, that was 3rd grade before, but no, you wrote it wrong. It was actually in the 4th grade. That was 3rd grade that we did before. So I said, well, I'll teach my fellow classmates how to draw a horse. Now, I didn't take Red Ryder. I should have, because his horses are much better, but this was one out of wash tubs. And so I carefully copied the drawing from the funny papers from the night before, and then drew it on the board for my fellow classmates. And then they were supposed to copy me. And they did, only Tony Knutson's horse was better than the one that I drew. And there's a lesson in that if you're going to be a teacher, you're going to have students who are better than you. Well, how do you get to an art world? Well, I've told you one way, by reading the Sunday funny papers. But in 1950, I had decided at this time I was not going to be a farmer, and I switched from agriculture to taking an art class in my high school. And I said, if I'm going to be an artist, I have to know what artists do. My parents had been getting Life magazine probably from 1941 or 42. In the summer of 1950, I sat in my aunt's basement because she had saved all of the Life magazines. I went through every copy of Life magazine from 1939 to 1950, carrying out every article on art. And there were really quite amazing things like Jackson Pollock. Now, Life magazine put Jackson Pollock in so they could call him Jack the Dripper and to make fun of his art. Nevertheless, they were showing what the avant-garde was. There was this dissident group of artists, among them de Kooning and Rothko. Hedda Stern is the only woman. Baziotis, you can see a bunch of them there, who were protesting the Metropolitan Museum's policy of not showing contemporary American art. I ate it up, and I said, I'm going to be one of them. There was Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel ceiling. So I took all of those articles on art and pasted them in wallpaper catalogs. They were heavy. They must have weighed, 20, 30 pounds. But I had, a really an amazing record of art. And interestingly, then I got to supplement it. Marge has already told you that in 1950, with the Boy Scouts on the way to Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, to the National Jamboree, we stopped in New York. I remember, I think it was at the Taft Hotel, but walking late at night, we were leaving for Washington the next day. I was on 53rd Street, looked up Museum of Modern Art, and they said, I could have gone there rather than Coney Island and the Yankees game. And I'm glad we did those things. But I said, when I get to Washington, D.C., I'm going to art museums. I left the Scouts and went to the National Gallery, bought the catalogs, made notes about the techniques of Toulouse-Lautrec, among others that I remember. But the most important thing was that in New York, the morning we were leaving, after having breakfast and dropping my nickel in the porridge at the automat, and instead of just getting another nickel out of my pocket, trying to fish the nickel out of my porridge so I could pay it. I was really a hick and so embarrassed. But I saw a book, an art book, in a window. It didn't matter what art book it was. It was the best of art. I remember going in and saying, I want to buy that book. And they looked around. It wasn't a bookstore. It was more of a variety store. They said, we can't find it. We don't have a copy of it. I said, yes, you do. It's out in the window. And it was a narrow window. I remember the manager of the store going in. He had a white shirt on. It came out all smudged with soot. But there was my book. This book was just so amazing. Emily Janauer, one of the best contemporary art critics, had reviewed what she thought were the best 50 art exhibitions of 1947, and had written there were the reproductions of one reproduction of each artist's work, and a critical piece that were quite insightful. And where did that go off?
You did the same thing I did.
Is there a way we can get to
Yeah.
it? I'm sorry. So, what I did, I carried the best of art back to Preston High School, and that was what I was going to show you. And I deliberately set about selecting and copying these works. Stuart Davis was my favorite, but Yves Tanguy, the surrealistic work, and I tried to show both of them. Now, if we can just back up from there,
That one?
they were cutting off quite a bit, but
It will,
okay.
I'll get
So
it. Hold it.
there is the
Don't go
Stuart
away.
Davis from the best of art, and
Don't push down, just on the side.
okay. This is where my high school art room was, and this is actually the storeroom. But I made my own, and my art teacher, who was actually the music teacher, but his wife had taken art classes in college and suggested assignments that he could give us. He allowed me to make my studio in that room, which was the storeroom, but it was a marvelous lighted room. This is the old Oneida State Academy, a lovely old building that my brother, who is into historical preservation, has actually had moved from the high school site. And Preston High School, if anybody has seen the movie Napoleon's Dynamite, that's where it was filmed. That's my high school. And so the drama teacher wanted a modern painting in one of his sets for one of the school plays, and so I painted that a copy of this for him, and after the production was over, he bought it from me for $5. I mean, that's about the most money I've ever made on my art. And so, Utah State University, I already knew the professors. One of them was a friend of my grandfather, and so that was the professors that come to my high school to judge the art contest. And so where else would I go but 20 miles down the road to Utah State University? At Utah State University, I actually had two lives. One of them was to be the window displayman. My high school art teacher took me down, introduced me to someone he knew at Utah State, who got me a job as a window displayman at the Bon Marché. I knew nothing about window display, but I had to make compositions, three-dimensional compositions in windows every week. And I got to paint the backdrops for it and so on. I mean, I probably learned a lot more doing that than I did at Utah State. But at Utah State, because I had this job, especially in my last 2 years, my professors let me sign up for the art classes and then let me do an independent study. And this is the old main at Utah State. This is the old heating plant, made into a ceramic studio. I made my studio down below the ceramic studio, clay dust sifting down. Those paintings I made using the first version's magma, the plastic paint, are probably at least half clay dust, but it made them interesting. And so I was used to doing my own stuff and working in my own way. And went from Utah State University to Cranbrook Academy of Art. And for 2 years, this is the most idyllic place. I would paint in the morning. I usually had 10 to 15 paintings going, and I would work on every one of them in the morning. And then in the afternoon, go to the library, walk the grounds, and so on. This is a faded version of probably the most interesting painting that I made while I was there, but it is actually a painting. I was a kind of reluctant abstract expressionist. This is actually a painting of my first grade class in Fairview Grade School. So my autobiography keeps getting into everything I did. Well, after Cranbrook, I took a job as an art teacher in the Salt Lake City schools because I didn't like the jobs that seemed to be available at the college level were in Kansas. I didn't want to go to Kansas. And so I was on my way, I thought, to California, but I stopped for a year in Salt Lake City, which is just 102 miles from where I grew up. And I had what would surely be considered a successful year as a first-year art teacher, because I've forgotten part of the story I was going to tell you. During my senior year in college, I was asked to teach one class each day to substitute for the art supervisor who needed release time. And so I had my own 7th grade class where I was expected to follow the art supervisor's curriculum. After I got through with that year, I said, I will never do anything like he asked me to do. And I owe much of my success to that determination. So you can learn as much from bad examples as from good ones. And but I had one art methods course at Utah State. We used as our textbook Victor D'Amico's text, which I can't even remember now, but he had chapters, the child as a painter, the child as a printmaker, and so on. And at the end of that first year of teaching, near the end of the year, the superintendent, this is Salt Lake City Schools, is a fairly good size. The associate superintendent came by to watch me teach, and then the superintendent came by to watch me teach. My fellow teachers were saying, what's going on here? Well, I didn't know what was going on either. The art supervisor of 22 years was retiring. They had selected the person to take her place the year before. And I don't know the story, but for some way or other, they found out he was a scoundrel or something. And so they knew they didn't want to appoint other people who had been in the district because they knew them too well, I guess. So they appointed as the art supervisor me, who had one full year of teaching plus my substituting while I was at Cranbrook, and that year of one junior high school class in Logan, Utah. And so my first task was to visit all of the 42 elementary schools, the 12 junior high schools as they were called at the time, and the 4 high schools. And I was depressed by what I was seeing. And just another little piece, the art supervisor, who had been there for 22 years, had an enormous exhibition that was to sort of honor her 22 years in the school district. So a huge citywide thing taking over the biggest and newest high school and artwork from every school. And she said to me, now, you shouldn't be too concerned if people don't understand what you're doing, because the stuff that my students were doing looked absolutely nothing like any of the rest of the stuff. Because as I was teaching my class, I was getting ready for my one-person exhibition in a Chicago gallery, and the kids were painting along with me, and they were doing really marvelous things. Well, as I made my rounds from school to school to school, being more and more depressed, I came across one teacher whose students were doing quite brilliant things. And I saw them in the hall, and I said, I want to meet that teacher. It was Bev Krieger. And I said to her, where did you learn to do stuff like this? Because, what students do is what teachers get them to do. And she said, I worked with Lowenfeld. And I said, who's Lowenfeld? And did she ever tell me? I mean, because that's the first I had ever heard of him. This is 1959. Well, immediately I bought Creative and Mental Growth and began to learn about Victor Lowenfeld. And actually, Lowenfeld came to Salt Lake City in I think it would have been the fall of 1959. Bev Krieger and I took the day off from school, spent the entire day with Victor Lowenfeld. I remember telling him I want to come to Penn State, and this is the kind of research I want to do. I'm interested in why creativity drops off at fourth grade, and I can answer that question now. It doesn't. It just changes. And I remember his listening so carefully and being so kind and encouraging. Actually, I was accepted at Penn State, but they said you can come and work on a master's degree. And I said, no, thank you. I already have one. And even though they didn't count Cranbrook as one. Now, so I went to Ohio State. I had actually, in a longer piece, I have written about going to the national conference of NAEA in probably 1961 and meeting Manny Barkan and Jerry Hausman. I had gone to meet Elliot Eisner, who was on the staff, because when I was when I was appointed supervisor, I did not have the certificate for it. I had to get an administrative and supervisory certificate. I went to the University of Utah, started taking classes. One of those classes was with Andrew Halpin, who turned out to be brilliant. None of you will have heard of him, but he was an irascible, a very difficult person, but absolutely brilliant. He had been at the University of Chicago, kicked out of there, but he was with Campbell and others, really good educational researchers. He had been fired from Montana, and here he was at the University of Utah teaching Introduction to Educational Research. And he was absolutely brilliant. And he said to me, there's a young guy at the University of Chicago named Elliot Eisner who's doing some interesting work on creativity. I'll get a paper of his for you. I knew Elliot Eisner before he was Elliot Eisner. And I actually took a copy of Eisner's paper to, who in the world was it doing the creativity studies at the University of Cal Taylor at the University of Utah, and talking about Eisner's work. It was Andrew Halpin who really got me interested in educational research. And that's why I went to Ohio State. And who did I end up with at Ohio State? Laura Chapman. We went in at the same time. We were assigned to an office together, and even when the offices moved, they kept us together. We lived together for 2 years. Quite literally, we were talking to one another every day. We were taking our French exams together. One day, Laura came in to the office with a lavender-covered book and said, "Have you seen this?" It was Rudolf Arnheim's Picasso's Guernica, the genesis of a painting. Laura Chapman and Rudolf Arnheim changed my life. If you don't know the book, published in 1962, as I remember, Arnheim takes all of the sketches for Guernica. In the book, you can fold out the big copy of Guernica, and then you see sketch one and how it relates to the final composition. It's absolutely brilliant. And I don't know, Laura probably quickly forgot about the book, or she didn't do anything with it, but it became my Bible, because it was a way of interpreting art in a way that was like Emily Genauer, but much deeper and quite amazing. Well, art teachers at the time were fond of going around saying, if you take art, it will help you to see the world, to open your eyes to the world. Well, of course, science teachers could say the same thing, couldn't they? And I said, well, that's a little bit broad, but maybe art instruction helps people to see art differently. How do I test that? Well, one of the ways is just to put something in front of people and say, what do you see? And so that's what I did. Among other things, I did 2 studies for my doctoral dissertation. One of them was, I devised a set of categories that categorize all the ways and the kinds of things that you could see and talk about a work of art or judge it or relate to it. And so this came about by the work with Arnheim's text. And then, in the Salt Lake City schools, because after 2 years at Ohio State, I went back to the Salt Lake City schools, I put 34 reproductions of artworks in front of kids and had them describe each one of them in serial progression. So I got 34 samples of each kid's language. And then I analyzed that language against the categories. What did I find? That kids were literal. The curriculum was based on the elements and principles of design. The kids never talked about design or composition. They only talked about the stories and the literal qualities. And even though kids in 11th grade made much longer responses than kids in 5th grade, they were the same content. In other words, it was, when it came to looking at works of art, it was as if there was no difference. And then the next question is, well, can you make a difference? A teacher, one of the really good classroom teachers who did a coordinating unit, she taught the art for other kids, and I sat down and rewrote Arnheim's Picasso's Guernica to be read by 5th and 6th graders. So here they had their own little textbook with a very careful first sketch compared to the final composition. What are the changes? What are that take place from sketch 1 to 3 to 4 to 5, along with so they were writing about the work, discussing it, and also doing art making. And so I tested these kids at the end of the program against kids who had the usual kind of art program. What did I find? That indeed, with an experimental program, you can make kids into art critics just by teaching them what art critics do. Amazing. And so people like Eisner and June McPhee began to say, oh, look, Wilson has shown that art makes a difference. And I say, wait a minute. If you teach in particular ways, art makes a difference. So I used those categories. I am still using those categories because it was a way. This is from a chapter that I was invited to write for by Benjamin Bloom, Hastings and Mattis, the handbook on formative and summative evaluation of student learning, but the taxonomy of educational objectives across the top, and then all of my categories, which I'm not going to even point to, but all the way from the sensory qualities down here probably to something like metaphor and analogy and what have you. In 1966, there was to be the NAEP, the National Assessment of Educational Progress. I was invited to one of the early meetings, and we looked at the objectives that had been written by a group of people who were hired by ETS. There was not a single educator nor art educator in the bunch. They were people like Catherine Koo, the poet. They're not Catherine. Is it Catherine Koo? I mean, there were people who museum directors and artists and so on, had no notion of what was going on in the schools. I said to the National Assessment people, well, the first thing you have to do is rewrite the objectives so they have some relationship to what's going on in the schools. And then the ETS had developed a volume of art questions that were like art history examinations, multiple choice. I said, Well, of course you can assess art, but this won't tell you anything that has about what's going on in the schools. So through a long process, I was asked to organize a team to rewrite the objectives and then to create the exercises. This took, did I say? Yes, 1966 to 1982. There are huge chunks of my life where I have been doing other people's work much more than my own work. And, well, and I think of it that way. It is my work in one sense. But at the same time, I kept puzzling about how should we do research in art education. I spent a year as a visiting lecturer at the Birmingham, it was the College of Art and Design that had just entered the Birmingham Polytechnic, which is now the University of Central England. I taught there in 1971-72, and as I did, I undertook a qualitative study where I had found out about the work of a quite brilliant art teacher working in a working class area. And he began to, I said, well, what happened when you introduced these ideas of sort of high culture to working class kids? And he began to tell me about his students who were working for the BBC, textile designer, sculptor. I said, oh, this is very interesting. How did that happen? Because it was more than you would expect that would come out of a sort of really ordinary working class school. I began to travel around Britain interviewing these students as they unfolded their lives for me. And it was absolutely, it was a marvelous adventure. And I was finding about, the most interesting thing is that none of the differences, the things that made a difference in their life took place in the classroom. They took place before school began, or the teacher got them out of the morning hymns and prayers and so on. And then they would take off, sometimes for several days, visiting stately mansions and so on. He was breaking all of the rules, and he had a headmaster who was permitting to do that. And I began to see that it was all of the things on the margin of schooling, not what happened in the classroom, that was making the difference. Marge and I have been writing about third sight pedagogy. Okay, and so, and this is sort of, in one sense, where Marge picks up. When I came back to the United States, I said I will continue the kind of work I was doing in Britain, qualitative studies. I began to look at what is art like in a little Iowa community. So I was studying the kinds of constructions and heritage walls that people were putting in their bedrooms. At the same time, I was looking at what the kids did not in school, but what they did outside of school. And this is, one of the teachers said, oh, well, it's a little bit more complicated than that. The teacher, I went into the art teacher's room, and he had put some of the kids' stuff that was obviously not school projects, but things that they had done on their own. And I said, oh, you're letting their kids put their own stuff up. And that was enough encouragement for him. He invited them. He said, I'll put up anything you want. And so then I watched as the kids come in and slapping it. Here are the 10 I did last night. I mean, they were doing all kinds of stuff outside of school. And then one of my student teachers who was working with me said, you ought to see what we have up at the other school, the Phantom Cartoonist. It was J.C. Holtz. And this was the beginning of case studies of this little kid who was 10 and 11 when I was working with him, was doing, he created Birdman, and it was a whole bunch of superheroes. And, well, hold on, let's see if we can get back to it. And so this is where M and B came together, because Marge did a really marvelous qualitative study of Ken Bidle's wood firing, where I said, you want to look at communitas happening? I was actually doing a participant observation. I asked Bidle, could I sit in on your ceramics class and observe what goes on? The first day of class, he said, this is a wood firing. we could do a wood firing. Well, this means going out to a kiln, and it means chopping up a truckload of kindling and then feeding it into the kiln for 48 hours. I mean, this isn't normal classroom. I mean, this is a site not in the classroom. Marge studied that and did a wood firing paper, which she has never published, which I think is absolutely brilliant. But she's done a lot of other stuff that I think is brilliant that she hasn't published because she doesn't care. Well, she does care, but she cares about the teaching, not the writing. Well, so what did we do? I sat in the back of Marge's classroom interviewing her kids about what they like to draw. These are high school kids. And everything that they drew, they could tell me exactly where they learned to draw it. It was, from this how to draw book, from this comic book, from this magazine, and so on. And so we wrote an article titled An Iconoclastic View of the Imagery Sources in the Drawings of Young People. And J.C. Holtz, a lot of artists had come to me, or art educators, said, that's how I learned to draw, was from the comic books and doing comic books. So it got a kind of nice reception. But when we published Iconoclastic View, there was an outrage because it really was the first postmodern paper in art education, and we were saying the kids don't unfold, with their natural artistic unfolding. They are influenced by their culture. Because we had challenged all of the things that Lowenfeld seemed to have stood for. And so what happened? There were critics coming at us from every direction. There was a special seminar symposium held on it, and a book published on it in the Netherlands. The most notable critic, but where is he? Let's go back. Well, it was Rudolf Arnheim, and his line, the first one, he said, the Wilsons are not iconoclasts, they're exhuming old mummies. And if people follow what they're saying, they're going to take us back to 19th century drill. Well, we didn't have any intention of doing that. But Arnheim characterized this little kid who was already at age 5 or 6, was doing foreshortening and knew what he was doing. He called it a deformed stump. I mean, he really didn't understand what we were trying to do. When he met us a couple of years later, I already told the story, but he said, "You don't have horns." I mean, he really had made us, in his imagination, some horrible devils who were out to destroy everything that was known about child art. But we were only using our eyes. If you look at the drawings on the left-hand side of the screen, these were drawn in Britain in probably 1905 or something like that. And do you notice, looking at the second frame in the upper row, do you see that profile with two eyes, and then down below 2 eyes? The two-eyed profile was seen to be part of developmental stage. It was called the mixed profile stage. And if you look at Creative and Mental Growth, even into the third edition, you find D.H. searching for his lost pencil, and it's a two-eyed profile. And yet, have any of you seen a kid draw a two-eyed profile? Even though Snoopy is a two-eyed profile? No. So we said, where did the two-eyed profile come from? And to make a long story very short, it disappeared at about the time of the printing press. And when kids could be influenced not by other kids, but by all kinds of sources, the comic books and what have you. We were showing how there is cultural style that you can see in kids' work. We were just using our eyes. Now, the second thing we were doing, the kids we interviewed, we found out they were who drew outside of school, they were telling stories through their drawing. And, I've been trying to hurry, and I really have to go into really high gear. telling stories, we thought, well, if a few unusual kids are so motivated by stories, why don't we ask lots of kids to draw stories? We created this little 6-frame scheme and said, tell us a story through the pictures you draw. Create a character, show what happens next, and how does it finally turn out? And what we found is just amazing, amazing stuff. Here, crying tree. The tree is sobbing in the first frame. The second frame, water begins to rise. In the third frame, it's going to drown itself. But a little figure swims up, and says, "Stop! Stop! Stop!" And the tree stops crying. The water recedes, and when the water was away, the little girl gives them plastic flowers and leaves. I mean, things like this as a fourth grader. It's absolutely profound. Well, we filled our book, Teaching Children to Draw, the 1982 edition, 2009 edition. We won't tell you about the awful stories of collaboration is funny. We each wrote the chapters about 3 times without remembering and telling one another and so on. But it finally did get done. And what we try to show, look at the drawings on the left. These are drawings from the 1980s by Japanese kids. Do you see those huge eyes, highlights and what have you, all the cute little animals and so on? 1980s from Egypt. Here is a culture that is saturated with the printed media and narrative and so on, and this is what the kids do. The Japanese kids, 5 years old, about 90% of them could create sequential narratives. In Egypt, even in the middle-class schools, only about 50% of 12-year-olds were doing sequences. I mean, we were finding just amazing, amazing differences in kids' ability to narrate. If we had to point to one thing that is at the center of our research, it is, and we talk about first sight, kids' self-initiated work, second sight, schoolwork, which is a kind of collaboration between student and child. It's really child-adult work. I mean, it's as much adult's agenda as child agenda. But then we think of a third side where kids and adults get together, or kids and kids get together and create art on their own because they want to, where there isn't the same kind of hierarchical status. And it's the same sort of thing I was learning in the British Secondary Modern School research, and what Marge was doing with Beidel in the wood firing paper. It's this marginal stuff where really interesting things happen, where it is a kind of gateway to life, the life beyond school. It is much more like what one could do on their own. This is one work done with 4 kids and me, where we would just say, oh, well, what should we draw? Let's do a natural history museum, one of the kids says, and we began to do a natural history museum with all of the crazy displays and the wild things going on, giggling, and one is probably, 7 years old, another is 14 or 15, and learning from one another, modeling after styles, creating little challenges and narratives. This is probably the metaphor that gets closest to what we're trying to do. And we did it again in 1987, teaching drawing from art. But look, go back to how did I learn to make art? It was from The Best of Art and from Life magazine. All of my life, I've simply used my instincts and my eyes saying, oh, there is a difference between what kids were doing 100 years ago and what they're doing now. You just have to open your eyes and then you sort of see commonsensically, this thing works. And so there actually have been the U.S. edition, a Korean edition, a Spanish edition, and a Japanese edition of the text. That's what it's like on the inside. And then this is what M&B's last collaboration, other than the second edition of Teaching Children to Draw. We were asked by the Getty Center to study art history, art criticism, and art production in selected school districts, working with Michael Day, Elliot Eisner, Robert Stake, and then the two of us. And what I was going to do is tell you a whole lot about how really quite good research boils down into an advocacy document that was provocative but had little to do with what we were actually about. Meanwhile, it's...
We don't have time.
So
Did you want to just go through?
I'm going to just go through. This is Marge learned to draw in the academic way, and in her own classrooms, this is what she did. And there they are. She got into trouble because the drawings her kids did, the models were dressed in leotards, but when the kids drew them, they didn't put the leotards in, and the work was exhibited at the town hall or something, and she got into real trouble. The Saturday morning school stuff, this is fascinating. Christo, the kids rapping the Nittany Lion. Marge has to come up now, because I can't talk about hypertext.
You don't have to, just...
But she started working with hypertext and computer, and it is just absolutely amazing looking at the context and the way in which you can use the computer to connect artworks with critical writing, with the cultural context, and in quite amazing ways. And then she got her students working with issues of the body and performance especially. And visual culture and technology. These are the categories in your hypertext web. Identity, entropy, and then the installation stuff. Was that supposed to be a video, but it's apparently not playing. This is Marge's methods course at Penn State, where the students were doing performances. And her students, the ones who go out, at least some of them, are still teaching in the way that, and this shows the influence of Charles Garoyan and Yvonne Gedalius, and especially Elizabeth Garber, who came to teach with us, with her notions of feminism. Colleagues really do change our lives and how we think about things.
Good colleague.
Huh?
Good colleague.
Good colleagues, yes. And so these are still works from Marge's kids' installations and performances. And they really are quite amazing.
And they not only did the performances, but they did videos of the performances. They videoed them, and then they made videos.
And then, if you go onto this website, you will find the artwork that Marge is doing. She's wearing one of them tonight. I'm wearing one of them tonight. I wore another one at dinner. She buys kimonos and kimono textiles, makes them into absolutely amazing things. Let's look at a close-up of the kinds of scarves that she sews. They're really beautiful. See the connection between that young woman just graduating from Mass College of Art, doing her placemats, and 60 years later, whatever it is. Yes, it is 60 years later. She's still doing the same
All right,
thing.
leave that, go back to that one.
Okay.
Because what I wanted to say, what I would have said, was that I feel that my greatest contribution is the teachers that I've taught. And this was a communication from Chris, and that's his performance. And this is what he wrote to me just last week.
He's teaching in Chicago, I think you said? While Marge was doing that, tending the shop at Penn State, I was asked to go to Washington, D.C., to the National Endowment for the Arts, to do the research and draft towards civilization. I had a brilliant plan. I was going to take a little child and move him or her through the whole system, school system in the United States, different parts of the country, with arts programs, rich ones, museums, awful schools, great schools, to give a whole picture. And so that's how I told the story. In one afternoon, the staff decided, this report is too long. I saw my 6 months of work, lines going through 2/3 of the pages, and this is the story. When you're working for somebody else, that's what happens. And so I got to tell my own part of the story. Then as soon as the NAEA project was over, and it was a marvelous time. I mean, to be able to be invited to live in Washington, in the old post office, and to see all of the political things. I was the lightning rod for everyone who was disgruntled or afraid of what was going to be in the report. I was getting it from everybody. I was saying, I'm just here doing my job. But watching how everybody was trying to think of what somebody else was going to think of what was going on. And, they kept talking about the White House and what will the White House think and what have you. I don't think the White House cared, but that's the way they were thinking. And then invited to become the evaluator for the Getty Regional Professional Development Institutes. Another 8 years of my life, quite literally, traveling half of the year from one site to another, summer institutes, and then implementation in school districts. The sorts of things that Manny Barkin and Laura Chapman and I, and we could say Eisner and a few others, were working on in the 1960s really began to blossom. And the reason I called it the quiet evolution is because the first question I asked when I became an evaluator was, what are these projects for? Is it to implement what you're already doing in Los Angeles? And if it is, I didn't quite say it this bluntly, it isn't worth doing. Or is it an opportunity to develop, to become research and development centers, to really see where this idea could take us? There was a great deal of consternation at the center and with some of the directors who had ties to the Los Angeles project. But Lonnie Duke and Vicki Rosenberg finally said, you are research and development centers. And I began to chart how even little kids were changing the practices. So it became bottom up, and lots of teachers with innovative stuff, given the opportunity, working with really bright historians, critics, philosophers, and artists. And so it became a top-down, bottom-up thing that was really, it is still, I know that DBA is somewhat discredited. It's the best thing that I have seen in art education. I mean, going back to my doctoral dissertation, I was seeing the things that I could do with one experimental study and make a difference. I was seeing literally hundreds and hundreds of teachers doing that sort of thing. Even our colleagues, the visual culturalists, I say, look, you couldn't do what you're trying to do there without the foundation of discipline-based art education. Laura and I could probably have a lot of discussion about that. As soon as I finished in Washington, D.C., however, I had gotten one sample of Japanese children's drawings, and immediately I said, send me your comic books. It was the first time I had encountered manga. I could see the style was so different from anything I had seen in the West or in Egypt, where I had done a lot of work. And this is one story. It's titled A Planet in a Box. Have you finished your assignment? It was a failure. The assignment was to create a planet in a box. Well, what were you going to call your planet? I was going to call it Planet Earth, which as it destroys itself. This is done by a 14-year-old, but you see the manga style. I mean, absolutely brilliant. You see social consciousness and a popular style, and to me, it's just absolutely elegant. But that was the point at which my Japanese research assistant said, "Oh, you've got to know about these." She brought back some doujinshi manga, which are the things that kids, they draw their comic books or manga and have them printed slickly, and then they sell them in comic markets. There are 2,000 comic markets in Japan held each year. This is the biggest one at Big Sight, held for 3 days. Nearly 500,000 kids come in to buy what another, 100,000 or so kids are selling to other kids. And it's adults who have arranged all this. We've, with Masami Toku, I knew that if I was going to do this study, I needed a Japanese collaborator. It was Masami Toku. We arranged to meet in Tokyo, and we are still writing on our studies of the comic market, the manga groups that the kids organize themselves into groups. And you see that one page? The catalog that I showed on the previous page has about 1,400 pages of those postage stamp size things that are, each one is a doujinshi group or circle, or an individual kid that calls himself or herself a circle. They get together and create these marvelous manga doujinshi. It starts even in elementary school. This was done in Sapporo, in Hokkaido. Elementary school kids doing their own little doujinshi. It's like fanzine manga. But that's elementary school stuff. I mean, it's quite good, isn't it? And here is a group of kids in Taiwan who they decide to do Harry Potter. And there are 10 of the kids, and they invite 2 more, and then they have to decide who's going to be the editor, what stories are going to be. I mean, they have to plan in just quite amazing ways, and they keep one another's quality high, because if somebody has low quality, it takes the whole group down. So there's an amazing dynamic in these groups. And so I have been writing about that. This is the inside of one. It would look old-fashioned now. This is what my research assistant brought back. More recent work that I mentioned briefly, I've said that most school art is a collaboration between adults and children. And we have to call it adult-child art. We call it child art. But you can't see it as something that children do. They only do it when in some sort of interaction. It can be all the way from a kind of glorious collaboration to a kind of extreme coercion. And in some cases, the stuff that's most coerced can look the most expressive. So you have to know what goes on behind it, as well as what the kids are doing. I really am in the last 5 minutes, and I apologize. Should an art teacher be an artist? A promise to myself. When I took my first teaching job, I said, if you ever stop making art, you have to get out of education, because that was the way I made my money. I have kept my promise to myself, sort of. It really, I started carrying sketchbooks first, then I started occasionally writing little notes in my sketchbook, and it wasn't until I was on my sabbatical leave in Egypt in 1981, perhaps. What does it say? 1980, that I began to live inside my sketchbook, drawing and the kids' drawings on walls, writing poetry about the kids' drawings. When Masami and I made our first visit to Japan in 2000, I said, "Oh, what should I do when I get there? I'll do what Max Ernst did with his 100 Headless Woman. I will cut up Japanese manga and create new manga." I started doing it, and I said, "This isn't working." I'll mix Max Ernst with manga. And that's what I started doing. And then I began to study how things that I can't explain to you just happened. Saito is the one who drew this, the original manga, and Masami and I interviewed him. Masami is fearless. I mean, she had us interviewing, among others, Miyazaki, the famous animator, the Walt Disney of Japan, or the world now, among others. But Saito is he was done Gogol 13, and this is a piece from it, and where the piece takes over and begins to create the meaning almost in spite of anything I did. My sketchbooks led naturally to what I'm doing now, which is to create artist books. This is 4th grade, and my father gave me 2 cents a dozen for cleaning the yuck off eggs before we took them to the Egg Association. And I would clean these things dreaming of the books that I was going to buy with this money. The first book I bought, because we had read Flicka in 4th grade or maybe 3rd grade, I thought, oh, Thunderhead, son of Flicka. And I buy this book, take it home, I read the first line, "The foal struggled to be born." I said, am I supposed to be reading this stuff? and then I began to show the book to my little friends that you can see over there. And among other things, this story could get far too long. I had horses from the time I was 5 because it was my job to take the cows to pasture after milking, bring them back. And after I would ride my horse and get the cows to pasture, I would go hunting pretty rocks. And I would take the pockets full of rocks back, and I constructed huge ranches with the shingles and with the rocks that were the horses and cattle and so on. And as an adult, I started thinking, this is strange. Riding a real horse to find rock, these pebbles to turn into horses. And so a lot of my stuff is, these rocks can become anything. These are sort of meditations on the creative process. I had done lots of paintings and sculpture, alternating between sculpture and painting almost every decade. And I said, all right, I've done enough big bad stuff. I'm going to do stuff that's little. I started creating artist books and folios. This is one, Autobiographical, about cleaning eggs and collecting books, but created in Hong Kong, where I was teaching in 2003, where I was cutting up Chinese books and making them a part of what I did. I actually carried the exhibition because I can fold up my accordion books into one big roller suitcase and wheel it anywhere in the world. So this is an exhibition in Hong Kong. This is an exhibition at the BYU, but still there is my my aesthetic failure of the mud pie, but here are the stones being turned into horses. Long view of the exhibition with this is a meditation on Chairman Mao and his evil, so on. And what am I doing now? I create most of my works as digital collages online. This is the first one of a series that now numbers over 1,100 collages based on the Inferno from Dante's Divine Comedy. And these are 2 images that Marge picked out. These are the harpies, but each is a digital collage. Here is how my work merges from one thing to another to another. This is actually one of my Hong Kong books. I was there during SARS, scared to death. We all thought we were going to die. Everybody had to wear face masks. And at the same time, I was doing these books about diseases, and that's what this is about. But then online, I turn it into this diseased person becoming the phoenix bird, new life, and so on. This is actually a collage of the phoenix, self-portrait, and pages from my journal. So all of these things, the journals, the artist books, are coming together. And how does one reflect on all of this? This gets even worse. When I did the Studies in Art Education lecture, I tried to do decades and influences from the art world, art education, all of the ideas I was encountering, all of the things that I was producing. I don't expect you to try to read it. This is just the kind of complexity. I brought it up to date for a lecture going from 1990 to 2008 with all of the publications, the kinds of theoretical works I was encountering. What I'm trying to show is how one's life, even though it seems fragmented to people who see pieces of it, it's of a piece. And I think we had some marvelous writing somewhere about how, it's Foucault who says what one is doing in one's writing is writing oneself. I paraphrased it badly. But I see all of the things, the research, the collaboration, the teaching, the evaluation work, the artwork, as all being, each of these parts feeds the other parts. And that's the end. And I apologize. I'm sorry. When what I have ended with is Marge and I stopped writing together quite a long time ago. Our collaboration has been one of sort of feeding one another every day by critiquing one another's ideas, questioning. It's probably more the questioning than anything else. So in one sense, it has been a funny collaboration and a very difficult collaboration, but a richly rewarding and fruitful collaboration.
Thank you so much. Please talk to them, have some refreshments there. Thanks so much for coming. Thank you.
Well, and we apologize for
It just kept not working. That was driving me crazy.
It's okay. Computers are a little touchy,